At Digital Science, we're on a mission to make research the best it can be for as many people as possible. But not everybody is part of the research conversation. So to find out a bit more about why that might be and what we can do, we're joined by Professor Dame Athene Donald. Professor Dame Athene Donald, Athene, thank you so much for joining us today. I wonder, can I start with maybe the hardest question? Can you tell me who you are and a little bit about your very broad background in research and beyond?
Okay, I will attempt to do so. Yes, I'm Athene, and I was brought up in London. I went to Cambridge when there were no mixed colleges, so I had to go to an all-women's college. And I studied natural sciences in Cambridge, specialising in physics, and then went on to do a PhD there. Spent 4 years at Cornell in the USA as a postdoc, and then came back to Cambridge and have been there ever since.
Wow. And tell me a little bit more about your research background, because you started in physics, but I'm just keen to tease this out. As a material scientist, that's kind of the route you initially took, really, isn't it?
Yes, I did undergraduate and my PhD in the physics department, but when I went to Cornell, I joined the material science and engineering department there. I was working on electron microscopy, specifically on metals. But after 2 years, my money ran out and my husband was doing a PhD there. So I needed to get another job. And the job that came up was in the same department, but it was on polymers. So I switched from metals to polymers, and it was amazing because I wasn't really doing very well in metals. But using the same tool of electron microscopy, but working on amorphous materials, it was just transformative and it was brilliant. And I've, if you like, never looked back.
Wow. I find electron microscopy, it's a little bit like the better the microscope, the more science you can do. It's very much the opposite end of telescopes. You know,
Yeah.
the more light you can gather, the more you can see, or the further into the past that you can see. So I guess if we talk about sort of material science, what excites you about material science?
I think it's the understanding. When people say, why did you want to do physics? It was all about understanding the world around us. So my PhD project was concerned with grain boundary embrittlement on a model system, but it was tied to the failure of turbine blades. And I liked that applicability. And when I switched to polymers, it was, why do plastics fail? So it was the same kind of thing, but on different materials. And over the years, if you like, I've moved away from traditional material science. I first moved into food, which is polymers, food's full of polymers. And then I moved more into biology, but it was still about trying to understand the world around us. And that's what I love about these subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with material science, because it's so cross-disciplinary as well, it's not just the physical sciences, but also the way that society kind of adopts these things as well, how society uses these products that we create. It's funny, actually, because you talk about plastics failing, but maybe that's something that we need to investigate a bit more. You know, plastics can be engineered to fail after their useful life so that we can start to break them down.
But I mean, you can take a biodegradable plastic bag, and yes, it breaks down and it's got starch in it, but you've still got little bits of plastic. So you need to go further, and to some extent you may need to go towards the biological realm to see if there are bugs that will eat the plastic, for instance. I mean, people are working this out. So yeah, it's absolutely cross-disciplinary.
I think one of the things that we're passionate about doing is breaking down those silos of research information, of knowledge, so that we can facilitate that discovery of information, of microbes that might be able to digest plastics and things. But as a chemist or as a physicist, we may not know that knowledge exists until we start to look at it. So I think from my perspective, I love the fact that technology is really enhancing and facilitating the way that we can cross those divides in knowledge so that we can overcome those challenges.
I think this country's not brilliant at it because departments are still very much in silos. The American system does have more likelihood of people having joint appointments between two departments and things. But I think interdisciplinarity is hugely, hugely important, and I've banged on about it for years because the funding system doesn't necessarily make it easy. And it's too common the case that a grant can fall between two research committees or research councils, and we need to do better at that.
Absolutely. It's funny, I think there are so many little tweaks we could make to the way that we do research in the UK and globally to really foster productivity in the work that we're doing. But it needs that global buy-in almost, doesn't it? And all of these different, governments and funders and publishers and institutions all getting on board with this and deciding the way that we measure success or the way that we kind of deem a research output to be successful massively needs to change.
Absolutely. Incentives are crucial. The culture is also crucial because you can find established professors who are very protective of, I'm going to work in this place and I'm not interested in this wider thing. And I was very much up against this because when I worked on food, people thought physicists don't work on food and were quite sort of critical about the fact that I thought there was plenty of polymer science in a starch granule, for instance, how the molecules pack. It's still, if you like, material science. It's not the chemistry end in the sense that it's not at the molecular level, it's at the sort of supramolecular level. But people were really quite hostile to me doing that initially. And of course, now it's much more fashionable to work at the interface with biology, but back then physicists didn't.
Gosh, it's baffling, but it's really nice that we can reflect and see hopefully how far we've come.
There is progress.
With some way to go still, I think.
Yeah.
What would you say your biggest success has been in your material science and your physics career?
It's really hard. My mother used to say, what have you ever done? Because I'm not solving cancer kind of thing. And I think in some ways, I would like to think that the fact that I did make this transition to working at the interface with biology made that slowly over the years a more acceptable thing to do in the UK. So I would like to take a little bit of credit for that because I think just challenging the status quo was important.
And challenging the status quo is something that you have done not just within physics, but you've sort of tackled aspects of research culture as well, particularly around sort of equity, equality, diversity and inclusion. You've held numerous positions across the sort of research ecosystem. You've worked in what was BIS and is now BAYS. You've represented the issues perhaps that we have within research. You've done that on an institutional level. You've done that as an individual researcher. Tell me why it is so important that we engage with people on all of these different levels, and perhaps maybe tell me a little bit about how you got involved in that and how other people can get involved to advocate for the changes that we need.
I think it's important because if you only have a subset of the population trying to solve a problem, you'll get a very narrow perspective and may not find the best solutions. You may not ask the right questions. There are many instances. If we take drugs, for instance, if you only test drugs on 6-foot-tall white males, you're probably missing quite a lot. And there's plenty of evidence to show that companies have had to withdraw drugs because they found they had side effects, for instance, on women or on different ethnic backgrounds, which weren't anticipated. So you absolutely need to think about these things from all angles. If you're thinking about smartphones, technology, hey, look, we've all got smartphones and they're getting bigger and bigger and women's clothes just don't accommodate the larger phones. So, that's in a way a trivial example. But I think just having different people in the room to say, have you considered such and such is hugely important. So we can't afford to lose so many people from the talent pool.
It's really interesting you mentioned clothes and phones. I'm genuinely in this current quest to find a pair of running trousers that has a back zip pocket that can fit my phone in, because I can't run without a phone. because I'm a woman and because I would feel unsafe
Absolutely.
doing so.
Yes.
And yet I'm not able to find clothing that can accommodate that.
Yep.
But that is just one of the issues that we're facing, isn't it? How can people get more involved in this, particularly in those sort of engaging with policymakers, for example?
Well, I think you know, there are many ways. No MP is going to want to know about the fact that running trousers don't have zip pockets. But I think, you know, you can write to your MP about issues that concern you. You can write articles, be it, I mean, a lot of what I did started off on my own blog. There's no barrier to entry on something like that. I've been, I suppose, because I've come to this relatively late in my career, I did have a platform, if you like. And so it was easier to communicate my frustrations, if you like, to highlight the issues. I think if you're earlier in your career, you have to find like-minded people in your institution and band together, be it setting up a women in physics group or something. I've got increasingly concerned, though, about women only talking to women, because we all have to be in it together. And I think it is important that young men, I mean, if we're specifically talking about gender, which is, of course, what I know most about, you know, young men have to recognise what the issues are. And people have said that the pandemic was great because the men were stuck at home with the children too. I'm not sure how it panned out, you know, whether that is something that has continued. I don't know. But I think, you know, we have to be all in it together.
I think actually that aspect of sharing lived experiences, sharing real life stories is really important. I think perhaps as women or, you know, people as part of other groups that may feel that they don't have the sort of amplification or representation in the room, if we don't share those lived experiences, people just don't understand because they won't have experienced it. But I think we have a tendency perhaps to normalize it, to, you know, that we talk a lot about everyday sexism. When you think about the small things that we do as women to risk assess and then protect ourselves just in society generally, I don't necessarily know whether men would have to do the same things or the same levels of things that we do, like, you know, interlacing keys in our fingers as we walk home late at night, or putting headphones in if we're on a train, just so that people don't talk to us because it's that international signal of I can't hear you or I don't want to hear you.
Yeah.
So how important, I mean, you talked about communicating. How important is that then?
I think it is important. I think we have to recognise that young men are probably the ones who get most violence directed against them in a really serious way. Women tend to get low-level unpleasantness, be it catcalls or, you know, sort of brushing against you or whatever it may be. I think we should talk about it. You mentioned everyday sexism. I think Laura Bates has done a fantastic job in bringing that out into the open. But of course, the trouble is if we go back to our labs, there's research culture which isn't even as explicit as that. It's that you're not invited down to the pub, or you don't feel able to go down to the pub. It's sort of men making sure you don't get access to the equipment in the same way as their bros. You know, it's all that kind of stuff. And we really need to bring that out into the open too. And I fear at the moment our universities are not good at tackling that at all.
It's really interesting. I'm very privileged to be interviewing Bonnie Garmus, the author of Lessons in Chemistry, in a few weeks at the Royal Society of Chemistry. And of course, that book is riddled with things that really do tell the story of what it's like to be...
It was the 50s.
It was the 50s, but it's surprising, I think, how much still persists.
Yes.
Little games that we need to play in order to have that equal footing, even in the lab. It is frustrating. I wanted to talk about communication again, because I suppose research and teaching and engagement or communications are sort of all part of the research endeavour. Now, you said that you had quite an established career before you were able to use that platform to communicate. Do you think we value communication enough within research, both science communication, but also advocating for challenges in research culture?
No, almost certainly not. I mean, I didn't actually say I waited, as it were. It was more that I was too busy getting on with my research to notice some of these more societal issues, if you like. But then it made it easier when I wanted to speak out. I think different institutions have different attitudes towards the importance of science communication. My own university, I think, certainly lists it as something that will be valued, but to what extent it is, I don't know. Some people are absolutely brilliant, but of course, if you spend your life communicating, you don't have time to do the research, and research is undoubtedly more heavily weighted. And, you know, to some extent, I think this is true of teaching, that teaching itself isn't valued as much as it probably should be. So I think this is a way to go. But, you know, you can do communication intensely or just slightly kind of thing. And one of the areas where I think anyone can do something is to go into schools and talk about careers and what you've done in your life and what it's really like, because I don't think science lessons are often not taught by people with a science degree. We know that there aren't enough teachers. But I think that, you know, going in and saying, if you study maths at A level, say, just think of all the things you can do. If you study physics at A level, look, you know, it doesn't mean you're going to be a physicist. You could do all these things, including being a communicator. And I think giving those kinds of examples is very important.
Definitely. It's a sort of aspect of role modelling, I suppose, isn't it? And all of that awareness of the range of careers that are available, but also the skills that you develop doing one of these subjects as well.
Yes, I think it's too easy to think, I can only be a physicist. And in fact, there are just hundreds of opportunities in different places that you can use your critical thinking skills, your problem solving skills, you know, all these kinds of things.
Yeah. I was very lucky. I studied many chemistry degrees at UCL, and they have quite a solid foundation of involving you in outreach activities and science communication activities. And I suppose I was quite lucky that that was a part of the expectation on us as PhD students, as postdocs, to get involved in that kind of community engagement, particularly as well, and schools engagement. But I suppose it goes back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of incentives, because if we don't add value to something, if we don't say, actually, this is important enough for us to be able to measure this as a positive thing in your annual appraisal or whatever it is, then people just won't value it, and the research will continue to be the main focus, squeezing all of that out. So what would you like to see, if anything, what would you like to see change?
Well, I think, you know, some people probably shouldn't be allowed into schools because they would put people off. So, you know, I think one should have, in the current phrase, a basket of metrics kind of thing. But certainly I think outreach should be in there and valued. But I don't think everyone has to do the whole spread of things. But I think the trouble is research is still, I won't say overweighted. And it's interesting because the new plans for REF 2028 do give more weight to things that aren't simply research. And whether, I mean, I know Eliza really wants to push this and has always been very keen on this. And I think this is her voice coming through. But whether it will change culture, well, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, the impact and the engagement, 25% now, I think, isn't it?
It's
the
gone
next
up,
REF.
certainly.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that's really interesting. And as you say, there are lots of ways to do outreach. I mean, you've written, you've gone into schools, you've done amazing demo lectures. There's lots of different ways that people can do that. And I think that's really important to remind people they don't all have to be standing on a stage in a school doing an elaborate, you know, Christmas lecture style demo.
I think that's really important because some people would find that very intimidating. And maybe, you know, there are other things that they could do, mentoring, for instance, which is something else I think is really important.
I also think not just for school-age children. I did, back when I was a lecturer, I did a master's on retention of women in engineering careers. And we do so much to scaffold this idea of role modelling up until people get to university. And then we sort of stop. And people run out of people that they can relate to that have stayed within the profession. And so I think there is an aspect of mentoring that we could look to help people stay within the profession and be aware of the range of academic or alternatively academic careers that are out there.
I think that's right. Mentoring is a strange thing because if you're assigned a mentor, it may not work. The chemistry may just be all wrong. I've had 2 fantastic male mentors in particular. I mean, I haven't particularly had a female mentor, but people who will look after you, but you can't just dial it up, as it were. So, you know, if you're an early career researcher, you need to look around and see, who do I click with? And you have to, I think you should be fairly proactive about that.
And different mentors for different aspects of your career and of your life. It's funny, we talked about men as allies. My 2 mentors, Ivan Parkin, who was my PhD supervisor, and Mark Miodovnik, an amazing material science communicator as well. But yeah, mine both happen to be men too.
And I mean, when I've looked back at the things I've done more recently, my mentor from Cornell, but both my mentors are dead now, my mentor from Cornell, Ed Kramer, absolutely shunned any committee work he could get away from. Whereas in Cambridge, Sam Edwards, I mean, he ran the Science and Engineering Research Council back then when that was its title, or possibly even before that one. You know, he was absolutely full of sort of public duty. And I think that mixture was quite interesting because you could see the one who really just concentrated on research and teaching, and Sam, who was much more a public servant in a very literal way.
It's fascinating, yeah. Different mentors for different things. I love that.
Yeah.
You said that you grew up in London. You actually went to Camden School for Girls, didn't you?
I did,
Which is, you know, many prolific graduates from that school, including Emma Thompson.
Indeed.
And of course you.
She's the most famous, I suspect.
And of course you. It was set up, I understand, by a suffragist. Is that correct?
Whether she was a suffragist or a suffragette, she believed in women's education. I would think, I mean, the school was founded in 1869. I think she was before women really got busy about the vote. But she absolutely believed in girls' education because that was a time when, you know, most middle-class girls were expected to stay at home and, you know, talk to the vicar. I don't know what they did.
It's very Pride and Prejudice.
Yes, well. So I suspect, you know, she was determined that she would provide a space where middle-class girls could go and learn. And some of them, of course, then went on to university. I mean, so my undergraduate college was Girton, which was founded in 1871, so just shortly afterwards. But there's one thing that I find quite funny. So Camden still calls itself Camden School for Girls. Its sister school was North London Collegiate for Young Ladies, and there was a real social distinction. Camden was the school for the tradesmen's daughters.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But it was a single-gender school.
It absolutely was.
So I also went to a single-gender school, and I think, and there have been studies on this, I think the Institute of Physics has done a study on this, showing that people that go to single-gender schools, particularly girls
who go
tend to pursue STEM subjects. Is that correct?
Well, the
more so.
Institute of Physics specifically looked, in the first instance anyhow, at physics A-level. And yes, now you can say, well, those parents who choose to send their daughters to single-sex schools are more supportive and therefore, you know, encourage it. So, you know, it's correlation. Is it causation? I don't think that's completely proved. But yes, and I think it is. You know, I always attributed it to the fact no one told me it was odd to want to study physics. I mean, there were very few girls in the science sixth form at all in my day. And I was the only one who wanted to go on and study physics. But no one said that's an odd thing to do. And it wasn't until I went to Cambridge that I really worked that out, that there weren't many girls around. So I think that's part of it. The teachers aren't sort of encouraging the boys and discouraging the girls. And there are no boys in the class to say, are you sure you want to do that?
Yeah. It's really interesting you said that. Quite embarrassingly, I think it was the world's biggest science lesson or something many years ago. And I took part with my old school. And they did little interviews and vox pops with the people that were helping out. And I was quoted as saying, I didn't realise I was a woman until I was a postgrad, in terms of being a chemist, because it had never been a thing. It had never been an odd thing to do.
No, and chemistry has more women than physics does.
It was very even, especially I think at UCL, really quite kind of even. maybe there were slightly more women than men at undergraduate level. But I remember as a PhD student going to present at a conference, and suddenly, and I'd been in my bubble of a reasonably progressive university, really supportive lab group, brilliantly supportive supervisor.
Yes.
And being a woman had never been a thing. I was just a chemist.
Yes.
Until you start then seeing the rest of the research culture, and you think, oh, no, I'm massively underrepresented. And then you start to be treated differently. You start to change the way that you behave, the way that you present. What can we do about that?
It's interesting. I mean, I had a rather different experience because when I went to Cambridge, as I say, I was at a single-sex college because there were no mixed colleges. There was only 10% of women across the entire university, and I knew that's what I was going into. Didn't particularly strike me that physics was odder, but physics in some senses wasn't odder. It was just 10% across the board. So I knew I was odd, but for a slightly different reason. What can we do? Well, get the numbers up, make sure. And I feel very strongly, if you look at psychology, say, again, the Institute of Physics looked at this, a subject like psychology is 80% female at A level. So we're losing the men. And so I'm not saying every subject should be 50-50. I don't know. But I cannot believe 80% women in one subject and 80% men in another subject is natural. I think it is the stereotyping. That starts so early in our children's lives.
And this is actually something that you touch on in your new book. I'm going to read the title. It's called Not Just for the Boys, Why Science Needs More Women.
Why we need more women in science.
Why we need more women in science. Apologies. Now, you really talk about this, how we need to almost have these, I don't want to say interventions, but these actions that we need to take at quite an early age, because all these societal ideas of who should and shouldn't do various things takes hold so early on in kids' lives.
Yes. I think, everything like the toys we give our children, the clothes, the messages on the shirts and things. I think children imbibe this. I think there's plenty of evidence to show that as they start to work out, are they boys or girls at sort of 3 or whatever, they will internalize these messages. And then it's harder to overcome that. I'm not sure we need interventions so much as eradicating the biases that are present, if you see what I mean. I think it should be more passive. Why do we think that girls like wearing pink? Because that used not to be the thing. Back, I think, certainly before the Second World War, red and pink were male colours. So there's nothing intrinsic. And yet we split the world. And of course, if you don't fit into either binary, then it's even harder. So why do we do it? Why don't we just treat them as people? And then maybe we'd find out what the natural percentage is, as it were, in a subject like physics.
I suppose as technology has developed and the world has become much smaller, I suppose these ideas can take hold on this global scale, and they are hard to stop then, aren't they? So what would you like to see? Would you like to see popular culture play more of a role in equalising things?
Yes, I've always felt, EastEnders should have a female apprentice engineer, and we need to change the dialogue in our media representations that algorithms, I think, are potentially really dangerous because you often don't quite know what an algorithm, what's being put into that algorithm. So I think we are actually at probably a more dangerous position than we were, because I think if you train, there was this thing about Twitter that if you train a sort of language bot on Twitter, it will turn out to be misogynist and racist. And, that's not good. So how do we stop these things happening by accident?
It's really tricky, isn't it? I think as we talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, the training data harbours these inherent biases anyway, and you don't want to propagate them. So I suppose it's one more example of why we absolutely still need humans, but we need a diverse range
Yes.
of humans
Yes.
to be sense checking it, to almost negate the biases
Yes.
as best we can, because everybody has unconscious biases.
Of course. Yeah, we're all guilty.
Yeah. So I suppose it is yet another argument for greater representation, greater diversity of thought and lived experiences
Yes.
in order for us to create the best technology.
And we need it now. I mean, the trouble is we don't have the diverse workforce, and yet now is the time we need it. Or, you know, I think we're at slightly a crunch point in the way these things are developing.
Which I suppose leads me to my final question then. What do we do about it?
What do we do about it? Well, I think we talk about it a lot. We remove guilt to some extent, because I think it's quite easy for men to feel threatened, for them to think that women are blaming them, or that, you know, white people to feel that the black community is blaming them. I think biases are inevitable up to a point. You just have to be conscious of them. So you need everyone to be on board thinking, how can we find the best solutions? How can we nurture the talent? All that kind of stuff. And we need people to think very hard if they're making a decision, be it about recruitment or whatever. You know, what are you doing? What are you feeding into this decision? But it needs everyone to be on board. And I think, you know, I like the quote from Camilla Cavendish at the FT, who said, "We will know we've reached parity when mediocre women get jobs at the same rate as mediocre men." And I think, you know, that's a good summing up of the situation. But we all have to be part of that.
I could not agree more. Professor Dame Athene Donald, thank you so much for spending the time with us to have a chat with us today. Lots to work on, but very positive things that we can take from your work and from your book.
Thank you.
Thank you.